friends, kindly settle down in your seats so that we can start the next very important substantive session, which is on financing for clean transition and global financial architecture. The stage for this discussion has already been set in the previous session, where the mention was made of the staggering resource requirements and how you struggle to raise them to enable implementation of the climate action goals and the sustainable development goals. So that is what we will be discussing in this session. And there are 5 speakers, including Professor Kevin Gallagher, who is joining online. Dhananjay, is he online already? He is. So, so we will begin with Kevin's presentation online, and then we have 4 more speakers within the room physically with us. So I'll go over one by one to each one of the 5 very distinguished speakers. Professor Kevin Gallagher is the director of Boston University Global Development Policy Center in Boston, which has emerged in the last few years under his leadership. He is actually the founder of that center. It has emerged as a very important voice on global development issues. And Kevin and I go back a long time, for 20 years at least, working on different aspects of global trade governance and how it can be made more development friendly. And so we have had opportunities of working together in a very sort of intense manner off and on. And it's very unfortunate that Kevin could not be with us physically today because of regions which nobody could control. And he is joining us from his isolation in Paris. And we really look forward to listening to him and wishing him speedy recovery on behalf of all of us. So, Kevin, you have the floor.
Ambassador Nagesh Kumar, it's with combined regret and great pleasure to be here with you at the same time. As my friends have already shared with you, I got COVID-19 on my way there, and I'm stuck in a hotel in Europe. I haven't been in your great country since 2018, and it had been long overdue, and I was very excited to join you. As a co-chair of the T20, I will be back, and I'm going to make sure I'm back healthy. I hope my voice will hold through this presentation, but the main points that I want to make are that without ambition and a well-functioning global economic governance, we will not be able to achieve global energy transitions that matter. While a major part of the motivation for such transitions are that they are a source of a new economic growth path, it is also, of course, to fight global climate change. And if that isn't globally coordinated, we all suffer. The cornerstone of a global effort is a stepwise mobilization of finance, especially in developing countries, as my friend Amar Bhattacharya will no doubt stress. The International Monetary Fund, which I think Lavish and Amar will each touch on, is essential for this to help national governments mobilize in capital and transition in a manner that is fiscally sound and financially stable, while reforming its toolkit to respond to climate shocks and help countries make structural changes so their balance of payments are suitable in the long term. What is more, the trading system, the hard wiring of the system, needs to foster this financial transformation and provide the right incentives for production and consumption and encourage technology sharing. But I'm going to focus my short remarks on development banking, given that my country, the United States, has spearheaded reforms at the World Bank that are due to close this year and are motivated, at least in part, by the need for the World Bank to do a better job to address climate change. These reforms are welcome. And of course, developing countries have advocated for reform of the World Bank for decades. But to be successful and be aligned with clean energy development trajectories, reform needs to have 4 key elements. Number one, there's a need for a stepwise increase in the scale of lending that cannot solely be met by implementing the capital adequacy framework recommendations from the G20, nor by mobilizing private capital. Number two, regardless of whether the World Bank changes its mission, there's a need for significant policy reform to get the policies right. Number three, there needs to be built-in mechanisms for quality control and accountability. And number four, of course, all reform needs to be coupled with increased voice and representation for developing countries and their citizens. Let me quickly try to elaborate on each of these 4 points quickly. As I said, no reform is possible without a major capital increase at the World Bank. There has been some lip service now from the major shareholders that they might promise to do it after implementation of the G20 capital adequacy frameworks. I would be careful about such promises. As we know, United States election cycles can swing very quickly in very different directions, and I would make those a part of the reform process to be baked in. As the Sangwe Bhattacharya report that Amar will no doubt mention, it shows that we need to be mobilizing $2.4 trillion a year to 2030, $1 trillion a year for developing countries. And that solely can't be done by the capital adequacy framework implementation and by leveraging private capital mobilization. In fact, private capital mobilization needs a concerted effort in rethinking. The IMF's Global Financial Stability Report in October shows that the effort has not been so robust, especially at the World Bank. One area for new exploration is public-public partnerships. India, of course, has numerous development finance institutions. According to the Finance and Commons Summit, national development banks hold $14 trillion in assets, are mission-driven, and demand much lower rates of return than much of the private sector does. Organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank and the New Development Bank that India, as a member of the BRICS, is sitting at the table at, have done some pioneering partnerships with national development banks that bend down the cost of capital to finance clean energy. Second point is that regardless of whether we change the mission from fighting poverty and creating shared prosperity in a sustainable manner, it's academic if it doesn't translate into real policy change and reform. Right now, the way the World Bank thinks about climate change, it's seen as a series of negative and positive lists about the kinds of projects that should and shouldn't be funded. And then there's an accounting exercise to put different kinds of projects in different buckets. Taking climate change seriously means helping countries bolster the role of the state to create policy frameworks to mobilize resources for the big push and structural change that's necessary to build low carbon, resilient, and socially inclusive growth trajectories at a rapid pace for global net zero by 2050. It's important, we have to remember that more than half of MDB loans, especially at the World Bank, aren't for projects, but they're for policy loans. And if financing clean energy projects in the face of poor policy frameworks, say tariffs or subsidies for fossil fuels, a green project might be touted as climate finance, but it may be going against the wind in a country and not have a real impact on the real goal. Development banks need to help countries with policy frameworks so the project finance is wind in the sails rather than going against the wind. Third point on quality control and accountability. It's paramount to ensure that MDB financing is growth enhancing. A recent article in the American Economic Review shows that while Chinese development bank projects overseas are growth enhancing, World Bank projects are currently not associated with economic growth. In addition to economic growth, it's important for development banks to keep an eye on debt sustainability. It's just as important to preserve and enhance the credit rating of a sovereign member state as it is to be maintaining the AAA of the World Bank and other MDBs itself. Right now, in the midst of this debt crisis, the two largest creditors are private bondholders in the MDBs, and the two of them have worked hand in hand through de-risking for at least 68 countries. The ability to take on new debt is close to impossible. Policy frameworks need to safeguard that there's not only growth, but the growth rate exceeds the interest rate of financing. From a Bridgetown agenda perspective, this means making pricing and returns a function of climate vulnerability and emissions rather than just income. Right now, small island development states and large middle-income country emitters pay more for loans at the World Bank, even though their biggest barrier to this transition is the cost of capital. It's very important for all new financing from development banks, especially the World Bank, to also have disaster clauses so that when countries withstand a climate shock, they don't have to pay their loans in the middle of fighting a crisis. Finally, it's important that spending also be safeguarded from damaging natural capital in local communities, while at the same time significantly speeding up the disbursement of finance. The last thing I'll say is that any reform of the World Bank and multilateral development banks needs to increase the voice and representation of developing countries and the people in those countries. Of course, a capital increase would have to go hand in hand with more voice for countries, be part of the reform from the get-go, not promised by future shareholders who may not be in office when the future arrives. A major emphasis also has to be on the people affected by these transformations. My guess is that Lavish will talk about the profound fiscal impacts of shifting away from coal in India. This affects local governments, local capitalists, local workers, and local communities. These people cannot be left behind, but need to be put to the front of the line in a new economic transformation that should be the goal of development finance. And I'll end by saying, it goes without saying, that real reform will have to have transparent criteria for a global, open, merit-based pool of World Bank presidential candidates, rather than governance that's chosen by the major shareholders. Thanks so much. Again, I wish I could be there in person, and I wish I could even see it through my video. It's a great pleasure to co-sponsor this with the Institute for Studies in International Development, and I will power through as much as I can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Despite your sickness, you have put very clearly some issues for reform, and I think all of these are very well taken. This importance of expanding the capital base of multilateral development banks is really something which is so critical to be attempted very soon. In fact, just a week ago, Jeff Sachs was here, and he argued that the capital of all multilateral development banks needs to expand by 5 to 10 times. So this is really something which is for G20 leaders to focus on and endorse, and then, as you said, it has to go hand in hand with the voice and quota reforms to give developing countries more voice on the decision making of the global institutions. So thank you very much indeed for putting on the table some very important issues for the reform of international financial architecture. Now, I have the pleasure to invite to speak Professor Tetsushi Sonobe, the Dean and Chief Executive of Asian Development Bank Institute. Professor Sonobe, all those who know, has been a very distinguished academic in Japan even before becoming the Dean of the ADB Institute, and he's also, as was mentioned by Ambassador Chinoy in the previous session, he's chair of Think 7, the thinking counterpart of the G20 in G7, which is chaired this year by Japan. So over to you, Professor Sonabe.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagesh Kumar, for including me in this group of otherwise stellar panelists. So I'm not a specialist in this topic. I'm originally a kind of fieldwork type development economist, visiting the small enterprises and then ask lots of questions and collect data, very small sample size, and then run very primitive regressions, that kind of researchers. But I had many former students, PhD, masters, who are mostly the mid-career government officials from Asia and Africa. So then gradually I was getting involved in the international cooperation, that kind of things. And then I accepted to be the dean of ADB Institute, which is a Tokyo-based think tank of Asian Development Bank. So it's not, my institute is not bank, it's just a think tank. And then it's a multilateral organization. It's not Japan's think tank, but somehow in Japan, the policy think tanks are relatively few, and they are very reluctant to take the role of the hosting T7. So somehow I became the chair of the Think 7 this year. And then I proposed the cross collaboration between the T20 India and the T7 Japan to bridge G7 and the G20. So yeah, we don't have any other good idea to start the communication between the G7 and the non-G7 member countries in G20. Right? So that's why I'm frequently invited to those meetings in India these days. I'm becoming kind of Indian, I hope. And previously I said we are, part of me is kind of Bangladesh, and saying that, oh, look at the national flags. Japan is, red circle on white, and India, Bangladesh, red circle on green. Now the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida announced his policy priority, and then the #1 target is green transformation, just like this, green transformation. But so that means if the Japanese flag had green transformation, so Japan becomes the same as Bangladesh. But now I'm becoming India, so let me try to talk about Think 7 or G7 perspective or about this green transformation, and then also finance. So finance is about lending and borrowing, and then lenders, of course, they also want to contribute to the green transformation, but they face a lot of demand from the borrowers, so they have to think about priority. So in order to push them to lend more for green transformation, their priority must be changed. So what is important will be this market, this incentive must be corrected. I mean, the underpricing of fossil fuel must be, stopped. And then who stop first? Of course, it would be the G7 countries, because it's a group of countries responsible for historically, large emissions of greenhouse gases. So G7 should start stopping underpricing of fossil fuel. Why underpricing? Because the prices of fossil fuel completely ignore the external diseconomies. In addition, the fossil fuel receive lots of subsidies. So the consumption and production subsidies of fossil fuel must be stopped. Okay? So that will be the first step. So G7 countries should start first. But of course, the stopping or raising the fossil fuel price will hurt their economy, especially their industries, especially when they have to compete with other companies from the non-G7 countries where the fuel price remain low. So if there are those G7 country companies faced such disadvantage, this policy or this movement will not be sustainable. So that means there must be the adjustment of price. So maybe the experts that's why proposing the climate club. Okay. So let me repeat. So first things to be done is stopping the underpricing of fossil fuel, and then the carbon pricing must be improved, and then also other option. But there is something good before going to climate club. So what can the G7 countries do after raising the fossil price? The government of G7 will have more kind of tax revenues, like carbon tax, and also stopping the subsidies. So from these channels, their revenue will increase. So the revenue can be used for more support for the green R&D and then other things. And then also, not only these recycling revenues to public support for green innovation and also green infrastructure investment, maybe it can be used to help those people who lose jobs. So this is an important path for just energy transition. But this is only within G7 countries. And also it will be very unpopular from the rest of the world. Right? So because price adjustment is just, simply put, it's just an import tariff. And it's kind of punishing the non-members outside the club. So it will be not popular. But because this externality is this economy is global scale, so the climate club must be scaled up. So it must be more popular thing. So how to do that? Yeah, of course, it is very important to assist the emerging market and developing economies. So maybe carbon price floor would be different. So G7 countries very high, but emerging market developing economies lower, and then very poor countries much lower. And also there should be lots of assistance to help the green transition or green transformation in those developing countries, the emerging countries, emerging economy countries. So there are already just energy transition partnership, JETP, and also the partnership for green green infrastructure and investment. So lots of monies are now going from the G7 countries to those like-minded EMDEs. So India is, recently joined the JETP, so also Senegal, and previously Indonesia and Vietnam. And then the first one would be when it was when the COP26 was held. I think South Africa, yeah, joined that program. And then there are other assistances, including the Asian Development Bank's energy transition mechanism, and many others are emerging. So the G7 countries and the rest of the world will push this way. And then we are very lucky today to have Dr. Amar Bhattacharya. He's a real specialist of climate club idea. So the details of the climate club idea will be explained by the doctor. So I would conclude that yeah, it's very nice to have this meeting and then discuss this important issue from both the T20 perspective and also T7 perspective. It would be not so as productive to discuss climate change without someone from the big emitters like my country, unfortunately. But yeah, thank you very much for this giving us this opportunity, Professor Kumar, and also Kevin. I'm sorry that you tested negative. I hope positive. So I hope yours is just false positive. If you happen to be a real positive, so I'm sorry, but please take care of yourself and get well very soon.
Thank you very much, Sonobe-san. I think you have hit the nail on the right place. The developed countries, G7 countries, need to reduce the consumption and carbon footprints through increasing the prices of polluting things, carbon taxes, and collect revenue, reduce subsidies on the fuels, and that way they can get more revenue to assist developing countries in their clean transition. So I think this is something very important which needs to be sort of carried through the discussions between the leaders of G7 countries and G20 countries. This is how only we can achieve the transition to clean transformation. So with that, we have come to the point when we listen to a very acknowledged speaker and thinker on climate finance, Dr. Amar Bhattacharya, who joins us from Washington, D.C., where he is senior fellow of Brookings Institution, very global, very big think tank. Everyone knows about it. But Amar has been, for many years, a director of G24 group of emerging economies in the IMF. And before that, he was member of the World Bank, staff and held very senior positions. So he's highly experienced on the issue of finance, and we are very lucky to have him despite his very, number of commitments in the day. And so I was very doubtful whether he would make it, but his commitment, he did. And so over to you, Amar. We are all waiting to listen to.
Thank you, Nagesh. So the truth is not all what he said, but I'm here because Dr. Nagesh Kumar and Kevin Gallagher are long-standing friends and collaborators, and if they ask them, I have to oblige. And this is a very important discussion. So real pleasure to be here. Dean Sanobe, I'm not going to speak about Climate Club because that's a very important issue, but I'm going to talk about climate finance, which is the third pillar of the cooperation on climate clubs. So I have just 3 big points to make. The first is we are really at a unique moment in time. If you want to look at climate action and climate finance, the first is the world is in extraordinary crisis still, and the impact of that has been falling primarily on the developing world. We are still at risk of a lost decade of development, and we will need significant support for the developing world in terms of finance. Second, we are off track on virtually all of the SDGs. And the amount of finance that is necessary, there has been a gap. And as you know, Jeff Sachs has been leading work on this. I've been part of his group on an SDG stimulus plan, which Achim Steiner is pushing here. And what that basically says is actually if you make a big push on SDGs, it's good for SDGs, but it's also good for climate. That's a central point. And the third point in that basis I want to talk about is the scale and urgency of response on climate action. Okay. There is just no doubt that climate is really an existential threat. I mean, in India, we are likely to see the limits of human survivability in the next 30 years. You won't be able to go outside for more than 3 or 4 hours. So we have to remember that climate change is not some academic long term, but particularly for countries like India, it's an existential issue. So it behooves us to actually ensure that the actions get taken. Second, we have to recognize that actually acting on climate could produce very important growth and development dividends. Third, we have to recognize that will require massive investment for which we do not have the scale or the affordability of finance. And that is essentially the challenge we face on climate. And many, many people will say, look, don't tell us to act on climate, because we don't want to hold back our development. And my response is, if you hold back on climate, you will hold back your development. So you have to act on both climate and development, but finance is going to be a key part. So the second point I want to make is the climate finance architecture is obsolete and broken. We need to replace it with a different architecture. So as Kevin said, the work that we have done says if you were to take the kinds of actions that we are talking about on energy transformation, on adaptation and resilience, on loss and damage, on natural capital, developing countries other than China will need to invest $2.4 trillion by 2030 annually. Okay? That's a very big sum, but as a percent of GDP, it's not overwhelming. It's a reasonable sum. It's challenging, but reasonable. And what we argue is that of that 2.4 billion, 1 trillion needs to come from external finance. By the way, that's exactly the number that Prime Minister Modi put out there at the Glasgow summit. And we give the analytical backing for that number. Now, where is that money going to come from? So we put forward in the report that Nagesh mentioned 3 big buckets of where the money needs to come from. So the first is the criticality of the multilateral development bank system at this point in time in the following ways. First, they can actually work with countries on scaling up investments. Because if you don't scale up investments, all the finance is academic. At the moment, if you talk to private and public sector players, they'll say the problem is not money. The problem is lack of good projects. We do not have viable climate investments to be made. And the MDBs have a crucial role to work with countries under the country's leadership to help scale up investments, not one at a time, but transformation of systems. energy systems, transport systems, water systems, agriculture systems. So we have, if we are going to scale, we have to think around systems, not one project at a time. The second thing they do, which is very important, is they are the cheapest source of market-based finance on the planet, and as I often like to say, even looking at it from Mars. There is no other lower cost base of finance, but we have been unable to get the scale of finance out of the MDB system. We argue that in the next 5 years, MDB finance needs to treble between, in terms of the scale of support. How much would that cost? Nothing. When I say nothing, it may be cost about $20 billion. And when you look at it in terms of the scale of the available resources, not just in the north, think that we have in the south $3 trillion of reserves sitting around. So 20 billion to produce a 50% increase in the MDB system is nothing. If I want to double the capital of the World Bank by 300 billion, it costs $9 billion. Peanuts. Yet we are politically unable to deliver it. The second point is that a lot of the money, the scale of money, has to come from the private sector. But the cost of that finance is exorbitant. If you look at private finance in, for example, green transformation, you very quickly, in Germany it's 7%, Saudi Arabia maybe 10%, but very quickly we are in the 10, 15, 20, 30% range. You cannot have green transformation projects with that cost of capital. So I always tell people, if you say private sector finance is the solution, show me at what cost of capital, because that's really going to be a critical element. And the third is, we have failed to deliver on the concessional finance. We all know that the 100 billion was supposed to be concessional finance. At the moment, of that 100 billion, we've delivered about 85 billion, and of that, 30 billion is concession, 12 billion grant. So we have failed to deliver it. Now, while I think, as representing developing countries in these discussions, I've always argued vociferously that the other side needs to deliver, I also think we should stop acting futilely, meaning there's no point shouting and saying you haven't delivered if it's not producing a solution. So the solution that we set out is, let's find innovative ways to mobilize low-cost finance. I'm going to just give you some examples. One example is utilization and expansion of the SDRs. The African Development Bank right now is in the process of finalizing a infusion of SDRs for additional lending. We have the RST and the IMF. There is no reason why we couldn't use the SDRs much more. There is no reason why we couldn't have regular issuance of SDRs. What would that amount to? Ted Truman says if you had regular issuance of SDRs in line with global liquidity, we would be having 170 billion of SDRs a year, a very significant source of low-cost finance. The second area is to think about carbon taxation, carbon credits, compliant and voluntary. Carbon taxes for the South can be regressive, but in the North, there's tremendous potential to mobilize resources. There is no reason why we couldn't use that for some of the international transfers that we have. And if you have regimes of course, of carbon credits, you can use it both through compliant markets, but also voluntary markets. Not huge sums, but at least maybe, somewhere in the range of, 10 to 20 billion in the short run, 50 to 100 billion beyond. But it's important. Third, in a governance sense, you could set up innovative mechanisms which allow us to escape some of the governance difficulties we are facing. So, I often say that the democratic structure in the most democratic country, the US Congress, has been behind the lack of progress on IFI reform. Right? We can't do anything because the administration won't take it to US Congress for fear that it won't go through. And there has been no more true on the agenda that Kevin laid out. We have not been able to talk about capital increases because, the sphere of Congress, as I call it. Now, we could do something which is quite innovative. We could take the Global Infrastructure Facility, we could make it a climate lending facility, and we make it voluntary. Whoever wants to participate in it, participates. If the US doesn't want to participate in it, that's fine. So we will have to think creatively also around these issues of, scaling up the MDBs. The last point I want to make is the importance of governance. So, as again representing developing countries, I've fought very, very hard for voice and representation of developing countries, which came out of the Monterey Agreement. And we have made very, very marginal progress on that, Second, we have to reform the leadership selection process of these institutions. As it happens, I think we have a very good candidate this time round, but fundamentally, why should the US appoint the candidate? And third, we need to have a governance structure that forces the MDBs to work better with each other. We need to think about the MDBs not as individual institutions, but as a system. And finally, we need to create a new highway for private finance. Every 6 months, the amount of, money that people talk about in terms of institutional investor assets keeps increasing. On last count, it is $400 trillion. $400 trillion of institutional investor assets, which should be invested long term. How much of that is invested in the developing countries for green investment? Close to zero. So creating this new highway for private finance has to be a very important part of the change. So I think we have an agenda. I think it's extremely important for the G7 and the G20 to come together behind this agenda. And in this year, I think India's G20 presidency will be crucial in taking this agenda forward. I know colleagues at DEA are pursuing that very, very actively and vigorously. And with that, I have to apologize because as you know, I have another meeting all the way across town.
Thank you, Amar. I think you have lived up to the reputation. You have brought very clearly some very, sort of feasible goals to expand the climate finance in a very significant and substantial manner. So you have spoken about how the capital of the multilateral development banks has to expand, and if some countries are not able to do that, we should find other sources, creative sources, and expand that, get there. And then the SDRs, why should it be, one-time issue? It should be a regular, increase in the quotas and SDR allocation. The carbon taxes, again, it could be, devised in a very innovative manner that it yields resources. And then, the governance has to really improve, and why should leadership be decided by a certain country. And the new highway for private finance, I think going into the green transformation is very much desirable. I think all of these points are very well taken. Another thing which has been around on the table is this international financial transaction tax, on which Kevin and I have often written together, and many other experts have been supporting that. It was something on the agenda of G20 in the in the very initial years after the global financial crisis, but somehow with the it could not get the support of United States despite the French presidency supporting it very much and the European Union behind it. We could not get it through. I hope that also is something we can make a progress on in the coming years, now that Global South is leading G20. So I think all of these issues you have brought on the table, Amar, are going to be discussed. I know that you have very pressing commitments, and you have to leave. But we will continue to mull over these issues and discuss. So now I must turn to. Okay, Lavish, maybe you can come here. So I must turn to now Ms. Chandni Rana. She is the person handling climate finance in Government of India, and she is actually an advisor in the Department of Economic Affairs in Ministry of Finance, dealing exactly with climate finance. So I'm sure we will get a very authoritative view coming from the Government of India. What is the current thinking of the government on climate finance? How India is, going to exploit all different options that have been talked about, and there may be others that the government is thinking about. With that, let me invite Ms. Chandni Rana to take the floor.
Thank you, Professor Nagesh Kumar. And coming after very strong expositions from prominent speakers is quite a daunting task. But Professor Bhattacharya, Dr. Amar Bhattacharya laid out the lay of the land very clearly on how we need to progress on mobilizing climate finance, and how important it is if we have to address climate action, climate change issues right now. As as mentioned, India is probably one of the most vulnerable countries which will be impacted by climate. That said, so it is in order that I should explain to you the way in which the discussion is going forward in G20, and then I would come back to the discussion, the way India is looking at climate finance, what is the work that we've already done, and where is it that we want further reinforcements from on. So the G20 has two tracks, the finance track and the Sherpa track. The finance track has about 6 working groups. And this time, considering the importance climate finance has for the Department of Economic Affairs and is now center stage, we know how our Honorable Prime Minister spoke about it in 2021, and subsequently we've had 2 budgets, and all of that has considerable inputs on green and green transformation. So one of the priorities for the Sustainable Finance Working Group is to mobilize timely and adequate climate finance, and that's also India's flagship priority as far as the finance track is concerned. But that's not where the climate discussions are only located. It is located also in the framework working group, where the discussion is on the economics of climate change and the macroeconomic impacts that is going to, it would lead to if left without addressing. And then subsequently, of course, and rightly so, the discussion in the International Financial Architecture Working Group, where there is the discussion about strengthening the MDBs to be able to provide more resources. Under the Sustainable Finance Working Group, of which one of the elements is mobilization of climate finance, timely and adequate climate finance, the discussions are primarily threefolds. One is to develop instruments and mechanisms for mobilizing timely and adequate climate finance, meaning we should need to discuss amongst the G20 countries which are the instruments through which resources can flow at the scale that is required. And in that, we are in the exercise of listing out the instruments. There's deep detailing of the kind of instruments that are successful from MDB's point of view. What is it that developing countries, what kind of experience do they have? So that discussion is on way. Enhanced role of MDBs is the second leg of the discussion. It was mentioned by Dr. Bhattacharya that we need to enhance the role of the MDBs. We need to scale up, and that discussion is also in IFA in terms of both the CAF reforms as well as reforming the MDBs as such. But what is also true is that MDBs at present are not utilizing the resources that are available with it in the manner they should be. And when they're talking about no project-ready, proposals, it is project finance ready proposals. It is also important to mention that some of these mechanisms that provide resources don't provide the resources for preparing or the project reports. So that bit of initial resource is a considerable amount, and to ask, let's say, Senegal to provide it, or Uganda to make available that to be able to develop a project is just about impossible. And that's why much of the resource is lying unutilized. So that's another aspect that needs to be discussed. And how do we improve the efficiency of the MDBs is the question that the Sustainable Finance Working Group is also engaged with. The third pillar of the discussion is about mobilizing resources for early stage climate technologies. So much of our solutions will lie in the technologies that now have to be developed. And how do we deploy them? How do we demonstrate those technologies? Resources are required. How is it to be deployed? And how do we finance such ventures is the other area of discussion in the Sustainable Finance Working Group. So that's broadly how we are engaging as far as India is concerned. And the reason and the issue we must, how did it really come center stage for us is important to know. And that brings me to the question of where have we come from. We all know the ambitious targets India has put for itself at 2070 to be net zero. It's ambitious for a country which has yet to peak in terms of its carbon emissions, as compared to countries that have already peaked several decades ago. The European Union peaked in 1979. And they have yet not, they still need 2050 to become net zero. So it's a very ambitious target for us. And considering that, the resource requirements are immense. At present, of course, we haven't estimated the resource requirements till 2070. There are reports from various organizations that talk about resource requirements from 10 trillion to about more than 10 trillion, going up to 18 trillion as well, till 2070. That's the resource requirement that has been specified. We have, in the NDCs, estimated a requirement of 2.5 trillion. Now, how much is actually coming? So the estimates tell us that the amount of money that is being invested into clean energy or green transformation is about 1/4 of what India really needs. And that is only from domestic resources, and that is predominantly government sources. So the point that we are trying to make is that we need to scale up. Even now, our requirements are much more. We've already assessed that. But the domestic resource is the only way through which it is being done at the moment, mostly public, but also, so 87% or thereabout is the amount of domestic resource as far as investments are concerned. And of that, quite a bit of it is the public sector financing. So the question now is, how do we scale up, and where should are we giving a clear indication to investors, MDBs, where are the areas that we wish to invest? That's made quite clear. There are three broad sectors that have been identified for green energy transition, and that's because we need to diversify energy sources to enable that to be a stable supply of electricity. One is offshore wind, the other is green hydrogen, and the third is battery storage, where investments and technologies are required. All three require investments and technologies to be able to provide India the stability of electricity supply and energy resource that we so need. Because we can't, we are an energy, we still require energy to increase, because as part of our developmental requirements. And so that cannot be in any way compromised. And if these are the broad areas where resources are definitely required. Other than that, of course, there's a broad brush of sectors where resource requirements have been indicated, whether it's the urban transport or the sustainable habitat, or whether it is agriculture, especially adaptation requirements in agriculture, and also the urban management, smart cities, etc. So there is a broad brush of areas that have been identified for investments. What have we done ourselves, India has done, besides implementing a national action plan on climate change, which encompasses about 8 missions, where National Solar Mission is a part, but Sustainable Habitat is also one, Himalayan ecosystems is another, and so there are about 8 of them. But in addition to that, we are also creating an overall framework that enables finance flows to happen, whether it is in the form of the financial sector modifications or regulatory changes that are at present underway through the SEBI and the RBI, as also we are trying through the sovereign green market. You're aware of the sovereign green bonds. We prepared the framework last year, and subsequently there has been an issue. We've been able to get it at a greenium, as we call it, because it's a lower than the interest rate that would have had to be paid by the government otherwise. And these are primarily for the public sector projects that we have already identified. These are projects that are already evaluated and budgeted, and these are the projects that would get financed through this means. It also helps in deepening the green bond market, and thereby creates that environment to enable finance flows to happen. Coming to finance flows, it's important to mention about Dr. Bhattacharya's mention about 83 billion flowing into developing countries. The biennial assessment of the flows indicates, that's the UNFCCC report, that 803 billion was the flow in 2020. 803 billion, of which 83 billion came to the developing countries. So much of the flows, climate flows, are happening between developed countries. It's their own resources getting into their own country or in developed countries. The flow from developing to developed to developing is not really happening. So, so this is a minuscule amount. If you look at 83 billion by itself is small, but of the 803 billion, 83 is just also quite small. So it's also relevant to know that that whatever is flowing is actually not coming to the developing countries, and that's something that needs to be changed. And so not just expansion, but existing flows the composition needs to change. There was mention about carbon tax, and I'd like to respond to it. For India, we are already levying coal cess. In addition, we have a huge tax on our fuel. We're one of the most taxed fuel countries in the world. And that only indicates, we don't call it carbon tax, but it's an implicit tax it has the same impact because it does bring in the cost considerations. And therefore, it is important to take that aspect also into account. And taxes, as mentioned by Sonobe's son, it's not easy to impose. In fact, one of the most, the developed countries also find it difficult, right? The OECD working paper talks about how it's not acceptable even amongst the developed countries. And and that's something not, since if it has a public acceptability issue, considering that India is already taxing at the rate at which we are taxing, is it even possible for a country like India to go beyond what we are already doing in the context of carbon tax? That said, I think I can go on. I can talk about the recent budget announcements that have been made, whether this is in the form of the viability gap funding for battery storage, or it's in the form of the National Hydrogen Mission at 19,500 crores, or it is in the form of the investments that we have announced for energy transition at the moment, and also to strengthen our renewable energy transmission system. All indicating the efforts the country is making towards achieving net zero, also understanding its position of responsibility, being a country that needs to grow at a pace at a consistently high pace for several decades. There is huge resource requirements and energy requirements which have to be met, so we are looking at diversifying our energy sources. But then we do need the MDBs to finance more, both in terms of scaling up, also utilizing their resources, and there is a need to look at the figures that are already available to us, and addressing this absence of climate, not only finance but also technology, because much of this is going to be technology, and the technology access is also somewhat constraining for us. So that brings me to the end of my speech.
Thank you, Ms. Rena. I think you have really brought the thinking from the Finance Ministry of India and all different sources that government is tapping, including sovereign green bonds. A start has been made, and the effort to deepen that market for green bonds is going to be something very important over the years. And your reference to the fact that much of the money is flowing between developed countries and very little is coming to developing countries, something which G7 countries, T7 is taking note, I hope. So needs to be taken note of. And the carbon taxes, you're very right that we have very high, one of the highest taxes on fuels. So we are already doing the job. And the fuel subsidies, which were there, diesel subsidies, have been phased out over the years. So India is, I think, moving in that direction, that taxing the polluting materials and saving and reducing the subsidies and all that, and the budget announcements for the green hydrogen mission, clean transition are very well taken. So I think the final point that you made, that India needs to grow at a rapid pace for the several decades to lift people out of poverty, and that requires a lot of energy. So we need to work in a very responsible manner to ensure that we move towards clean transition without affecting our growth prospects. So this is a very big challenge that India faces, and I'm sure the policymakers like yourself in government are really very much pressed with these responsibilities to manage the transition in such a manner that there is a growth and there is also sustainability with it. So with that, let me turn to our final speaker for this session, Dr. Lavish Bhandari, who is currently a senior fellow at the Center for Economic and Social Progress in the new think tank, recent think tank in Delhi. But he has been for many years, founder and director of Indica's think tank, and he has funded, founded number of initiatives over the years. But I also, again, we go back a long time. He used to be at the National Council of Applied Economic Research for many years. And I'm, currently in this new role, he has been looking into climate finance related matters. So over to you, Lavish.
Thank you, Nagesh. Thank you, ISID, BU Global Development Center, Dr. Nagesh Kumar, for inviting me. And my obvious complaint is that you put me last. Now, what do I speak after Kevin, Sonobei-san, Amar, and phenomenal presentation by Chandani, who actually gave a fantastic, I think, overview of the situation coming in from the developing countryside. However, so I'll just take 3 or 4 minutes, and I think I'll try and cover something which has been alluded to here and there, but I think needs to be considered fairly seriously by the G20. Now, in the international financial architecture, there is, of course, the whole issue of that the need for funds, and of course, the funds are not adequate. And of course, the private sector is the only way eventually that this will work out. And of course, we are nowhere near where we need to be. I'd like to just start off with that it's not just about the availability of funds, but the capacities of the countries that are going to eventually utilize those funds. And I think there is a deep, deep need for enhancing those capacities. I'll start off the 2 most unfortunate examples around India that have happened recently, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. Weak economies worsened tremendously by either poor climate action or inaction. And in a sense, all of us need to find that middle path. But to find that middle path, we need the expertise, which for almost all of the developing world is missing, and of course to various different degrees. My guess is, I haven't done the number crunching yet, but for out of the 200 odd countries that we have, funds are right now available for about 100 to 150 odd smaller economies. I don't think funds is the issue there, and some people have already alluded to that. However, those funds are still not available for them, as was recently, Chandi just mentioned. I think the issue is not just about the fact that the developed world has not been aware of this problem, but essentially there is a capacity mismatch. You need a certain class of capacities. Now, what are these capacities that we need? First and the foremost, you need deep monitoring abilities, which I think IMF is to some extent building, but that's coming in from externally. You need those kind of capacities coming in from internally in those countries. And it's not just about obviously monitoring, but to be able to find the right kind of projects. Now here we have a serious issue with projects. Green projects tend to be front-ended. However, the way the needs are going to increase, we're going to have a succession of front-ended projects expanding in needs as we go over time. What that essentially translates to is that you need a very stable macroeconomic situation in almost all of these countries. Otherwise, it will not sustain. 10 years down the line, if we suppose we accelerate climate action today and we do not do it carefully enough, 10 years later, India will not be able to sustain what is required at that point in time, and that's true of all countries. So macroeconomic sustainability is perhaps even more important than early climate action. And I think the G20 needs to take a lot of, needs to recognize this, that is the core issue that we need to grapple with. Of course, the other problem is that as of now, almost all green projects are costlier than the alternative, whatever be the alternative, whichever be the domain. Now, therefore, you don't have projects because we are still, in a sense, comparing them against the alternative. Now, that is the other part of this whole equation that needs to be addressed, that will we fund more expensive projects? And if we do, where is that going to come from? It is not going to come from green bonds. I mean, the difference is like 5 basis points between green bonds and regular bond markets. I mean, in India at least, right? It's not going to. I mean, where is that that extra fund requirement going to come from? Is a deep question. I do think that another area which is not being talked about is that of negotiation. If we are going to have the private sector, which is going to be a large part of the funding mechanism that each of these countries is going to then interact with, then each of these countries needs a much stronger negotiation ability than many of them currently have. And of course, I'm not talking about India here. I'm talking about the larger group of, global countries. And related to that is this insistence of national guarantees that are coming in with green projects. You can't have that. I mean, if you do, then you're essentially creating a big, big challenge for the world, actually, not just these individual countries. And finally, if it is going to be debt-based, as it seems all of it is, you also need to think about the repayment. And the developing world has really suffered a lot, most developing countries in the past, when the repayment times coming through. So I think that these are the things that developing countries need to be able to have the capacities to be able to address. And the global financial architecture needs to strengthen these facilities in the developing world. I've taken already more time than I thought I would, so I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, Lavish, you have put on the table, I mean, on top of what previous speakers have talked, some very important points. I think capacity mismatch, the capacity to develop really viable green projects is going to be very critical. If we don't have that, then you may have money on the table, but how do you go forward? So absorptive capacity for green transition, I think it is very important. And for that also we need support, international, sort of institutions need to help most of the developing countries to build that capacity, and then also the negotiating capacity and all that. And the point you have made is that viability of these green projects is poorer compared to the existing solutions, and so left to the markets, what would you do? You will go for the existing technologies and solutions which are more viable, more profitable perhaps, and do not factor in the additional costs that they will create for the environment and carbon footprints. So we need to really come up with solutions, practical solutions to get the clean transition happen. And so I think between 5 speakers of this morning, we have got some very important ideas and most comprehensive kind of menu of issues and challenges that we are grappling with have been put on the table. So although we have passed the time for this session, but we can with your permission, cut into the lunch time and maybe spend 10 minutes with your permission to have some discussion because a number of very important points have been made. Of course, I think Kevin perhaps is still online, and Amar, of course, had to leave. But so, who wants to go? First, and yeah. So Chris, and let me see who all. Yes, Navneet. Yeah, and Reggie. So let's listen to them. So Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Nagesh, and it's nice to be in such a lively discussion. It was really interesting presentations. I just wanted to put a couple things on the table that weren't mentioned and see what people think about them. Amar referred to the SDG stimulus that the United Nations has put forward, albeit, and I'm a United Nations official, I'm sorry, it was too late, I think, to influence the recent finance minister's communique. We will learn later today whether it has influenced the foreign minister's communique, but we hope that these are proposals that are taken seriously. And definitely all signals we've gotten from the India G20 presidency is that they are. It's a question of the other member countries, of course. We dealt with a lot, two of the major issues that are in the SDG stimulus. This is the SDG stimulus. You can find it on the United Nations Secretary General's website. The two that you've dealt with so far, we dealt with in the discussion is the issue of new debt, new financing mechanisms, scaling up the MDBs, ways to do that, and also to a certain extent some of the liquidity issues, right, that are facing countries, particularly in the face of the kind of overlapping crises that Amar was referring to. It's the issue about the old debt and kind of the actual international financing architecture itself, I think, we haven't really brought up, and I just wanted to put that on the table. The current estimates are basically most developing countries, and we have a list, UNDP has a list of, I think it's about 60 or so. Debt servicing is going to occupy most of these countries' revenues through 2029 at this point in time. So in terms of additional financing on the table to finance their sustainable development, it's just not there. So coming up with a more development-friendly debt architecture is really critical. And the other thing, and that's maybe a sad story, it's a tough one, it's not going to be done overnight. On the positive side, I think another initiative that hasn't been mentioned and we are working really closely with them as well, and the French and the government of Barbados, is the idea of the Bridgetown Initiative, which really doesn't address the debt stuff so much, but tries to focus on some of these finance issues and using the existing architecture in innovative ways. And Amar referred to it a little bit. I just wanted to add on to some of that. The idea, we talk about the loss and damage fund, we talk about the need for climate adaptation and climate mitigation. I wonder what some of the panelists thought about this kind of idea of a division of labor among sources of development finance, because when you look at those kind of three baskets of climate needs, loss and damage, it's clear it basically has to be concessional. And that really has to come from more ODA, meeting of ODA commitments. When you look at adaptation, adaptation is building things like dams and walls, seawalls to avoid rising seawater and things like that. That has to come from concessional financing. I mean, nobody's going to make an income stream out of there. Where I think there's a real big potential to bring together this sad, perhaps blended finance story that has been inside the G20, is not at scale, is in the mitigation realm, because mitigation actually, still a lot needs to be done, right? Getting out of coal, getting out of all these dirty industries. There are revenue streams there, and that is where the private sector has a role to play. And Amar mentioned it, and I think, if I'm correct, the U.S. Treasury Department has about 650 billion in unused SDRs. I think a really reasonable and achievable proposal is to try to work, and it maybe can't be done under India's G20 presidency, but can be done under this troika, that we have going forward. Put together a climate mitigation trust that uses the let's say 500, 650 billion, whatever, of SDRs, or a new issue of SDRs, and uses that to crowd in private sector investing on the order of magnitude that we've been talking about is so unattainable. So I just wanted to put those on the table, and thank you very much, Dr. Nagesh, for inviting me again.
Thank you, Chris. I think very important points that you have put on the table. mobilizing and redeploying the unused SDRs, could be very important, and powerful tool. And also the debt servicing challenge. Most of the resources, if they flow and they are used for debt servicing, then what are we talking? So all of these are very important points. So
very quick observations / questions. Number one, can you think of a universal financial transaction kind of a small levy? I know you have already admitted that there are already levying a couple of taxes / levies, but can we think of that? That's number one. Number two is India's presidency is going. This will be followed by Brazil and South Africa. Can these three countries put together something innovative? We have been talking about innovations. Can we do something? Can we put together a different model to address some of these concerns, including early stage, including repayments? So, thank you. I'll keep it short.
Thank you. Very good points. IFTT, I believe it is an important proposal. And I hope the Global South in their time, T20 presidency can push it forward. Yeah, Rich.
See, I think all the speakers mentioned about green technology. Green technologies. I was wondering what is the method used for identifying a technology as a green or not green? Because if some incentives are to be given, there should be a mechanism for identifying such technologies as green and not green. So, what is the method used for that?
Any other? Yes. Go ahead.
Hello.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. My name is Ivan Matic. I'm from CPEC, think tank in Argentina, Latin America. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm representing part of Ambassador Chenoy's words on being the T20 part of this place where many voices are in the discussion. In CPEC, we work in financing green transitions and also in social policy, and I was wondering also, how can we add an extra angle to this conversation on how these financial resources that we are aiming to get can be invested, especially in the global south countries during the next years, in order to get to these green transitions. And let me, in this extra angle, add this idea. In the global north countries of the G20, the youth population and young population is between 11 to 18%. While in the global south countries, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, India, obviously, is between 20 and 29%. So there we have, I think that our demographics have a lot to say and have great implications in the type of discussions on how we think about these green transitions. And just to add to this angle, I think that when we think about how we invest these resources, we must consider that our young populations are part of that future that we're trying to build, and especially in education and social policy, we're finding new evidence of the importance of literacy, of numeracy, of global citizenship education, environmental education, to be able to build those capacities that were mentioned before in the discussion, in order to adapt these technologies, this infrastructure, this green transition. So I think we should also, even if it is not straight into the core of the financial discussion, this type of discussions need to be considered in order to make that pathway forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. And that would be the last intervention.
Hi, I'm Nishant. I represent a company called Voltus, and I've done a lot of green funding in the past as a practitioner, about 9 billion worth of it in emerging markets. One of the things when you talk about the volume mismatch in developing versus developed, when we talk about hard currency flows, is the FX risk or the interest rate differential. When we divert money from a developed market to a developing market, the biggest challenge is that often you will see the risk rating is much lower. And secondly, you will see that the FX hedging is really challenging. So what has worked most successfully in making those transactions rescale has been insurance schemes. Credit guarantee insurance schemes work really well rather than hard currency financing. And there are lots of small blended finance outfits which have come in place, but if that can be scaled up, that is really, really helpful.
Thank you. I thought you, yeah, okay, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. Just a quick question. You mentioned, Lavish Bandari, my question is addressed to, that the green technologies are costlier and therefore the private sector probably on its own won't be coming up with the finance. And I think in the earlier talk, we heard that only about 1/4 of the needed funding is coming from the government. So what can we do to incentivize the private sector to invest in these green technologies? Because on the other hand, if we disincentivize the conventional ones, it may hurt the industrial growth. So we have to give some kind of incentive for green technology.
Thank you. I think we have got some very interesting questions to the panelists. So let me, invite them to respond to maybe.
So, yeah, I'll just first start on the question on what is a green project. There is no globally accepted method of identifying what is green and what is not. But generally, some rules are used. We tend to believe that solar projects are green. There is many arguments on whether EVs are green or not. Some people allocate them as green, some others not. So, having answered that, you're absolutely right. I'll just go back to this issue of the green and green. And so, I think one of the hardest for taxes is precisely that change the incentive, the returns that you can expect from the differential in return that you expect. However, as this man has already pointed out, that's not just for India. Many countries already fuels are taxes for it. May not lead to that same package. That's one. The other part is, can really countries like, let's say India, can it keep on for how long can it continue to, let us say, subsidize storage, battery storage? It's not feasible. At least perhaps in the early stages it might be able to, but later it will not be able to. So essentially, we are all under the assumption, which hopefully will very quickly, is that these costs will fall as you have scales and as you have learning, these costs will be. But essentially, we don't know. We don't know by when that in that intervening period is where you need funds. That's
yes, so
thank you very much. We are changing the incentive. Otherwise, like partnership for green innovation. Green infrastructure. Yes. So money income, another name of green, but actually it's not used for non-green things. And then there is the EU pushes solar, but that's really not popular approach. So better change and people where the value things. So incentive should change by raising the carbon price. So to be the carbon price high and then incentive to reduce the cost, then naturally people go more to the real innovations. And then about the skills, so monitoring the skills of the credit skills. Those things will come together with scaling of the funds. Because what my colleagues at ADB doing is actually not just lending, but teaching or helping. Because otherwise, if the borrowers do not know how to use the so what the multilateral bank people are doing
capacity building, technical transfer, that kind of thing. So that must be your strength. Upgrade, not transfer, transfer, knowledge transfer capability. Thank you. And the final word by Stanley Elena.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments on the mention about 1/4 coming from the government. What I wanted to say was that the resource requirements are huge. All of it is actually coming from domestic sources. Much of it is from the government. And what I wanted to allude to, and probably I didn't, was the fact that this bridge between the requirement and actual flow needs to be bridged by the MPVs, greater resource flows from the MPVs to concessional finance, etc. And that's the problem that we are actually stating. So what we're saying is that this is how it is, and unless we bridge that gap, how do we make that transition to net zero? Of course, I mean, we're trying our best, but then the resource requirements are considerably higher compared to the overall flows. So just a comment on the green technologies. Most countries, there is no acceptable, but most countries then come up with a green taxonomy. So the European Union has a green taxonomy and so on. And when we were issuing the green bond, in fact, preparing the green frameworks, we've had to color our projects dark green, medium green, light green. And that's as per the discussion we had with our advisors at that point in time. What is it actually green, and how does financial institution look at, let's say, a solid waste project? Is it green or medium green or not green at all? So it depends on the technology there. Actually, it's so fast. So it's a debatable issue. It's an issue on which there's no clear homogeneous guidelines. Most countries come up with their own taxonomy to help investment for green transition. Just one more question. I think about the climate mitigation trust seems an interesting idea. I think we must have someone. I think this is something that is good. Probably you'll take it up in the. I hope you take it up in the Sherpa track, as you said. You might be ready with it by then. The universal financial transaction. I would invite you to send us a proposal. We have it examined. Yeah. And I think that's covered. The Troika. Yeah, there was a mention about how our issues to be taken forward. So we have a system of Troika. So the past presidency, that is Indonesia, India, the present presidency, and the presidency that is going to follow, Brazil. So that makes the Troika, and we have been consulting them constantly at the high levels. And the issues are kind of accepted by them as well. We hope to see that translate into action. And of course, it wouldn't entirely depend upon the presidency to take up what priority they wish to take up. But they are well aware of, and I think for them as well, investment climate projects is quite important. So I think it should happen that we see some continuity with Brazil. But of course, it will be their presidency priority.
And our friend from Brazil has just joined. So I think we have had a very rich discussion. Kevin Gallagher, who is speaker in this session, and myself, we are writing a T20 policy brief on international financial planning. Will the summit between and please take a serious look at that. Could be in our view, a perennial source of revenue, climate finance, hurting no one. I mean, not coming from any country budget, but and also helping to moderate the volatility of the short-term capital flows. So it could be a win-win from many points of view. So we will share with you. But I must really thank only 5 speakers of this session and all of you who participated in the discussion for a very, very rich and interesting discussion. Not for a second I felt that what are we talking? It's such an engaging and profound discussion, putting on the table practically all different issues that concern financing for green transition and global financial architecture. So it is really going to be a very interesting challenge for us to put all of these ideas together in a report, which could be tabled before T20 leadership and through them to the G20 leadership. But we will really try to do that. And so with that, let us give a very big round of applause to our